I've created a very simple, super cheap slider that can be made quickly with only a few tools, but it's what it can do versus a more traditional design that's important. Standard sliders have a head fixed to rails to keep the head straight. My design doesn't use rails, so I can create the same slide as a standard design or easily do a multi-pan slide around various objects. I made the previous design using rollerblade bearings and aluminium tube. But what I found was that the slide was too smooth. It was harder to control because there was no resistance. By having rails that glide across a base, it's still very smooth, but there is also a friction, which gives me a little resistance to push against so that I have more control. This allows me to more easily create really slow slides, which is handy as a lot of my videos are about close-ups and sliding around objects, not landscapes, so this gives me better results. By attaching a tripod mount, I can fix it to a tripod to help create slides on various angles. By changing the guide around from the straight edge to the curved edge, I can get a very accurate pan. The radius of my curve is about 1.5 meters. So as long as I set up what I'm filming approximately this distance away, I can pan around it whilst it remains in the center of the frame. Because the sledge isn't fixed to the base, I can also create a slide with a lift-off. So to demonstrate, I started filming flies on a pond, and then whilst I was filming, a dragonfly was zipping around the pond, so I tried to record its movements, but it was just too quick. So I foolishly thought it would be cool to quickly build an ornithopter instead to demonstrate a slide with a lift-off. It was one of its maiden flights, and I was practicing my route, but I was concentrating on the screen and not looking where I was going, and I crashed into a bush, and I'm afraid that was the end of that. I'm using a cheap ball head camera mount that I bought from Amazon, attached to the sledge. With the ball head unlocked, I can create slides that incorporate a Dutch angle, where you pan from horizontal to vertical, or vice versa, as you slide. I've made the whole thing in plywood that I've bought from my local builders merchants. Big DIY stores are generally more expensive and won't do offcuts. My local merchants always has an offcuts area where you can pick up pieces really cheaply, so all this plywood only cost me £1. Plywood usually has one side better than the other, so choose the best side for the sliding area and give it a good sand with some fine grit paper. On another piece of ply, I've created the guide. The curved side is made using a string compass and then cut out with a saw. You could spend ages sanding this curve, but for speed and smoothness, I bought a plastic strip from a DIY store that I've screwed in place to instantly give me a smooth edge to follow. The guide is held to the board with 2 bolts and wing nuts. If you wrap tape around the base of the bolts, they don't fall out when you change the guide around. The slider is made from the same ply, one rectangle with a hole in its centre for the sledge and 2 rails. I've rounded the edges of the rails and then wrapped them in thin strips of polypropylene plastic cut from an office file. I use double-sided sticky tape to hold everything in place and then drill and screw them to the sledge. Make sure your drill and screws are not long enough to go out the other side. Following experiments, I've added masking tape to the base and wrapped the rails in plastic from a poly pocket as it gives a slightly better slide. I've also added some strengthening ribs to the underside of the base to take a bit of bounce out of it. I read somewhere that with camera sensors, To get the best slide, you should try to travel the length of your screen every 7 seconds. So now I can mark my starting point on the base, and then slide until the starting edge is at the other side of the screen and make another mark. Now I have a marked distance that I can use to control my speed. So in less than an hour, I've built a super functional slider that I can then use to help tell whatever story my mind can create, like this one. Hey, where'd you go? Is this the end of Product Tank? Definitely not. If you liked this episode, please hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.